a sunken ship full of treasure, a perfectly preserved hippo, and an ancient Viking sword. All of these incredible things have been found frozen in ice. But not everything found in ice is ancient or an artifact. Some animals can purposely freeze themselves and then thaw out when the weather gets warmer. The only thing more interesting than these frozen animals might be frozen treasure, and there's been tons of it. From a plane worth $10 million to a box with $300,000 worth of jewelry. So let's chill out for a bit and explore the frozen world. Just don't forget your parkas. In Norway, 5,380 feet or 1,640 meters above the sea level, two hunters came across a unique historical artifact that had been frozen in the permafrost. It was a complete Viking sword, one of the best preserved models ever discovered. The Viking sword had to have been stuck in the ice for over 1,000 years, but was in good shape thanks to the high-quality iron and the freezing cold temperatures. The hunters had spotted the blade sticking out of the rocks and gently pulled it from its prison like a modern-day King Arthur. Experts figure that the permafrost caused movement in the stones, so when the ice melted, the sword was slowly brought to the surface. Finding a legitimate Viking sword isn't just like finding a piece of history, it's also like finding buried treasure. A model of an authentic Viking sword can run anywhere from $200 to $1,000 depending on the craftsmanship. But the real thing? Priceless and one of a kind, since finding real Viking swords preserved this well isn't that common. This particular sword is meant for a museum, but if you're a big fan of Viking weaponry, you can always buy a less complete Viking sword for about 10,000 US dollars. It's not only objects frozen in time that are resilient. The alligator is an animal that has been on our planet for more than 150 million years, and recently, residents of North Carolina got to see firsthand just how epic these creatures are. After a sudden deep freeze in 2019, alligators in North Carolina were found with their noses sticking out of the frozen water. But don't worry about those poor gators, they're just fine. This is actually a normal thing for alligators. They can sense when the water is about to reach freezing temperatures and stick their noses to the surface, so the ice freezes around them. Then they enter a state of brumation, which is just hibernation but for reptiles. Once temperatures start to go back to normal, the gators will slowly thaw out and get back to their normal gator activities. Since alligators can survive heat and cold, they seem like a pretty good investment for any nature park, and they're surprisingly inexpensive when they're babies. You can buy a hatchling for about $150, but a fully grown adult, a large one, can cost about $10,000. Do you think these prehistoric popsicles are worth the money? In the frigid waters off King William's Island in northern Canada, there lay the wreckage of a ship frozen in time. The ship is called the HMS Terror, and it was originally a part of British explorer Sir John Franklin's ill-fated expedition to find the Northwest Passage. The ship had been preserved for more than 170 years when Canadian and Inuit researchers decided to explore the wreck in 2019. Back in 1846, ice had trapped the ship, forcing the crew to hastily abandon it. But what remains is a stocked ship full of important artifacts and even papers documenting the tragic voyage. The frigid temperatures of the water, layers of sediment, and an absence of natural light appear to be why the Terror is so perfectly preserved. And it's a good thing it is, since the ship and its cargo are worth a fortune. And while the British chose to claim 65 of the artifacts found on board the vessel, they decided to leave the ship to the researchers who had found it, a $430,000 gift. But considering all of the preserved pieces of history found on the ship that are now on their way to British museums, the entire discovery is probably worth more like millions. Picture this. You find a small frog, frozen solid and unmoving. You assume the frog's time is over, and you bring it home to show off your strange find. But once you leave it on your table for a few minutes, you come back to a living, croaking, hopping frog in the prime of its life. So what gives? It's a wood frog, a small amphibian native to Canada that can literally be frozen alive. These zombie frogs are unable to travel large distances to escape Canada's winter, so instead, they have adapted to produce their own antifreeze. And when in this popsicle state, their heartbeat stops completely. As much as 70% of the frog's body becomes frozen solid, and they can stay alive like this all winter until the weather turns warmer, when they suddenly start to thaw and can slowly get back to their little frog lives. If you want to own one of these resilient creatures, it's actually not too expensive. You can get 75 tadpoles for about $150. Or if that many frogs is a bit too overwhelming, you could always buy a single fully grown frog for about $40. That's a small price to pay to have your very own zombie frog. During World War II, an entire squadron of 6 Lockheed P-38 aircrafts and 2 Boeing B-17s made an emergency landing in the ice fields of Greenland. The crews were rescued after 9 days, but the aircrafts had to be left behind to their frozen graves. One of those P-38s, now known as Glacier Girl, eventually escaped her icy prison. In 1992, the Greenland Expedition Society found her. She was under 264 feet, or about 80 meters, of solid ice, so workers had to break their way through to gain access to the abandoned aircraft. They used a hot water cannon to carve a cavern around the plane, and then they were able to disassemble the wreckage and slowly remove her, piece by piece, from the ice. It cost them about $3 million to restore the plane, but by 2002, Glacier Girl was in flying condition. Soon after, she was sold for $7 million. But later, she would go on to a new owner for a whopping $10 million. For Glacier Girl, being frozen in ice might be the best thing that ever happened to her. It's not strange for some animals to love ice, but it is strange for insects to love it. That's why the Antarctic midge, one of Antarctica's only insect species, is so spectacular. They spend over half of their lives frozen, and even the larva has figured out a way to dehydrate itself to avoid damage from the cold. But once fully grown, that's where the real freezing starts. Basically, they can quickly freeze their entire body to deal with the cold weather. If you can't beat it, join it, right? They can also go without oxygen for as long as a month, and they're so unique that scientists still aren't really sure why they're able to pull off these cool tricks. It cost researchers a lot of money for an Arctic expedition. 1-month-long trips to study these midges can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars in travel and equipment. But if you're curious about these strange Arctic insects, then you could always hop a charter flight for an Arctic nature expedition for about $12,000. If you get lucky, an Arctic expedition could be an opportunity to find a frozen dinosaur. Well, at least it was for William Hammer and his team of researchers. In the early 1990s, Hammer discovered a brand new dinosaur species frozen in the ice on Mount Kirkpatrick. They named it the Glacialosaurus hammeri, a 190-million-year-old species. The long-necked dinosaur was probably about 20 to 25 feet long, or 6 to 8 meters, and weighed 4 to 6 tons. It was a type of sauropodomorph, a dino group that includes some of the largest animals to ever walk the earth. The fossils they found in the ice were a partial foot, leg, and ankle bones. The exciting discovery took a lot of work and cost about $1 million. It took 2 field seasons and a ton of workers that used jackhammers, rock saws, and chisels to carefully remove the pieces from the glaciers. But considering that the new dinosaur species is an important piece of history, the hard work definitely paid off. And if they ever find more pieces of the fossil, they could fetch tens of thousands to millions of dollars at a fossil auction. Who knew dinosaurs could be so profitable? Talk about aged to perfection. 3 bottles of rare 19th century whiskey were found frozen beneath the floorboards of Antarctic explorer Ernest Shackleton's abandoned expedition base in Antarctica. They were bottles of Mackinlay's whiskey, and they were still good 102 years after the explorer was forced to leave them behind. Shackleton's stash was first discovered in 2010 along with bottles of scotch and bourbon. While the bottles and crates were frozen, the whiskey inside remained liquid, and it definitely wasn't going to go to waste. White and Mackey made it their mission to retrieve the bottles and create their very own whiskey based off the recipe. They flew to Antarctica to unearth the crates and then chartered a jet, which can run anywhere between $2,000 and $10,000 per hour, to bring the precious bottles home. Once there, they used a sample from the whiskey to create 50,000 bottles of a limited edition recipe based off the frozen find. Then they charged $157 per bottle. But is the vintage whiskey worth it? According to reviews, it's a unique whiskey with a strong flavor. But honestly, we'd be down to try the original bottle. You've heard of buried treasure, but what about frozen treasure? A French mountain climber got to see firsthand what it was like to find a box full of frozen jewels. Back in 1950, Air India Flight 245, also known as Malabar Princess, crashed on Mont Blanc in the French Alps. It wasn't until almost 70 years later that a French climber happened to stumble upon a box that experts think came from the famed crash. Inside the small metal box were shining rubies, sapphires, and emeralds. The climber came forward with his find so that the authorities can find the heir to the jewels. After carefully studying the treasure, the box and its contents were appraised to be worth $332,000. The French authorities say that if the heir isn't found within a couple of years, then the jewels belong to the climber. There's also the possibility that there are more treasures hidden from the crash on Mont Blanc, but so far, they remain a mystery. A hippo is not meant to be out in the cold. That's why zoos usually bring them indoors when the temperatures start to dip too low. So how then was an animal that likes a warm climate found frozen in a thick layer of ice? This tragic photo had been floating around the internet, but is that even possible? Experts say probably not. How would a hippo migrate to such a cold environment anyway? Hippos like warm rivers, swamps, and lakes and are usually found native to Africa. That's led many to believe that this frozen hippo photo is just a chilling hoax. But on the slight chance that it isn't, the hippo would never have wandered there by itself, since it costs about $100,000 to own a hippo. Did someone lose their very expensive pet in the ice during a cross-country move? Maybe we'll never know. But for the hippo's sake, we hope that it never ended up spending eternity frozen in ice. Which of these frozen pieces of history would you be willing to splurge on? Let us know in the comments section down below. Don't forget to hit that like button if you enjoyed this video, and subscribe to The Richest for more. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.